How was lunch? Oh, good thumb. Look at all the thumbs up. Great. So we have come to the part of the day where we have a panel of people who have a lot of award service experience here at the table. And they're going to tell you a little bit about what that was like, and then we'll be able to open this up so that you guys can ask your questions. So I'll give you just a little brief intro to these people along the table, and then they can tell you their story. First, we have Thom Barthelmess, who's the Youth Services Manager of the Whatcom County Library System in Northwest Washington State. That's right, round of applause. Next, we have Rachel Payne, who is the Coordinator of Early Childhood Services at the Brooklyn Public Library. And then we have Judy Zuckerman, not in alphabetical order, the Director of Youth and Family Services at the Brooklyn Public Library. And Vicky Smith, who you've already met, the Children's Editor for Kirkus Reviews. And do you want to start, Thom?
Sure. Can you hear me? Hi. So we've each got about 10 minutes, and I want to talk about two things in my 10 minutes. The first thing I want to talk about is really thinking about what it means to change your mind. We've heard a lot today already about changing your mind. And I think in all of my award committee experience, that has been a function of what's happened. That there will come a time when a book that you thought you understood, you realize you didn't really, and you had missed some things. And I would argue that openness to changing your mind is a really critical disposition as we get together to do this work. But I would also argue that it is not the point. We're not coming together to change our minds, but to expand our minds. And I think that that's a really critical distinction. We live now in a culture that really reveres the right answer. We see it in our public education system. We see it increasingly in our political discourse. There's a lot of fighting and arguing about we don't agree on things, and our job becomes to pick the right answer. And in the context of evaluative book discussion, I think where that can lead us is to start arguing with one another about which of our interpretations of the book in question is the right one. And individually, it can point us towards discussion aimed at convincing. That I'm talking about this book hoping to convince you that my reading of it was correct and yours was maybe a little bit less correct. And instead, I think, the point is to work together to assemble an aggregate understanding of the book that none of us could come up with individually. That the whole point of bringing people together to do this work is that none of us can really understand a book completely by ourselves, because we bring to it our baggage and our experiences and all of those things. And the benefit of having other really, really intelligent and dutiful readers to help is that I get to see what 14 or 12 or 6 or however many people are on the committee. Other people think about this book and understand it better than I could understand it on my own. That doesn't mean I need to let go of my initial assessment, but it does mean I need to expand my understanding of the book. The beauty of this construct is that it's really the best possible way to get better at being a librarian, because you spend really, really intense amount of time with really, really smart people understanding how other people respond to books, particularly books for young people, where most of us spend our days and our nights. And if you do it right and really commit yourself to listening to one another, then when you go back home and are working with young people who maybe read books that aren't your books or are looking for things that aren't your thing, your ability to help them and satisfy their literary appetites is super duper enhanced. So I hope as you go forward and think about this work that you don't only think about convincing other people to see the books the way you do, but also hope to learn a little bit more about the books. So that's number one. The second thing I want to talk to you about is hot air balloons. And this comes particularly from my first experience on the Newbery. I went in knowing that everybody at the table was going to be better prepared than I was, and that people would have reams of notes carefully organized in great big notebooks, and be ready to talk about these books in all kinds of detail. What I didn't anticipate was how much of that note-taking became ammunition, right? Was sort of stuff that concerns that people had about the books, mostly I think because I'm naive, but there you go. But there's no such thing as a perfect book. Every book that we encounter is going to have assets and it's going to have weaknesses. And certainly if you're serving on the Newbery or the Caldecott or the Belpré or the Geisel, whichever of these awards, every book that ends up at the table for discussion is going to have all kinds of merit. It won't be able to get there without it. And I like to think about the books as hot air balloons, and our job is to identify the one that rises the highest. And if you think about the flaws as arrows that you're shooting up into the air, trying to take those balloons down, what you end up with is a last man standing kind of a construct. And the book with the fewest number of flaws is not necessarily the most distinguished book. So instead of thinking about problems, weaknesses as arrows that we're going to shoot at these balloons, I prefer to think of them as the sandbags, right? They're the ballast that limits their ability to rise. And so what we're doing is measuring the loft of the books, right? The assets that send them up, and measuring the weight that might hold them down, and thinking about which one is going to go up the highest. So of course, it's important to know that there are books, right? There are problems or weaknesses or issues that we have with books. And of course, talking about those things has to be part of our discussion. But instead of trying to take books out of consideration, let's think about concentrating on what sends the books high and go that way. So that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and I'm very jealous. This didn't exist when I was getting started in ALSC, so I'm very jealous of you all. So I had the privilege to chair the 2016 Caldecott Committee, and I worked with that fabulous group of people. A couple of them are in the room today, and so I reached out to them, and I asked them, what are some things that you were surprised by in the process, and what are some things that you learned along the way? So I am stealing all of their great ideas. So one thing that they shared with me, and some of them have been mentioned earlier, but so I won't try to repeat, but one thing they stressed was how important rereading was. And I'm a terrible rereader. I mean, I think when I was young, I rarely reread a book, but I think that process of rereading just really helps you hone in on things that you may not have noticed before, and and Caldecott is looking and rereading and just really delving into that and spending time with it and looking at the art in different places and different contexts and from across the room as well as up close, I think is really important. So just re-looking and rereading is one thing that they stressed. And I think you often go into deliberations with these books that you love, but you're going to have to let books go. Not everything is going to be the balloon that rises, and that's hard. That's hard for, you spent a year, or maybe quite a year, but you spent a good chunk of your time looking at these books and rereading them, and it's hard if you really love them to let them go. But they still exist in the world. They had their 15 minutes of fame at the committee, so you can spread that gospel of that book, but it's, it may not be the one that the committee sees as the most distinguished. Another thing that they said is to listen to others. I think people have stressed that, and I'm repeating it, but I think it's an important thing to stress. I know some people don't have issues with the no sort of blogging or social media or talking about eligible books while you're on the committee. And for me, that really forced me to listen. The fact that I wasn't out there in the world talking about these books made me really listen to what other people were saying about them and to step back and to, be really centered in that role. So I think it's good practice doing that the year when you're looking at all these books, and when you go into the deliberations, it's that much easier to sort of hear and listen to what other people are having to say. They also talked a lot about respecting your fellow committee members, because that's really important. So I think so don't go to the dinners and the stuff that's sort of the peripheral stuff, because it's a way you can get to know people and feel comfortable with them. As well as listening to others, I think listen to yourself, I think, is huge. I think, I sort of, sometimes when I have a reaction to something that somebody's saying and there's a feeling bubbling up inside of me, and I sort of step back and why am I feeling this way? What is, is there a bias here that I need to question? Is there something why am I having this reaction to this comment that someone else is saying? And just sit with that. And, I think there's a little bit of Zen sort of ness in it all, sort of sit with that and sort of think about why is that bubbling up for you. And particularly if it's around some bias or sort of preconceived notion you had about something, because I think we all bring those into the room with us. And I always like to wait till I feel moved to speak, if I can. I mean, sometimes, I tend to, this is my own personal thing, I don't think I've ever shared it. I tend to, just sort of wait till my hands feel clammy and I have that sort of butterflies in the stomach, and it's like, okay, this needs to be said, rather than just thinking of this first thought that comes to my head. And I think sort of being a little bit, intentional, I think, is really important, because there's a lot of things that are just first thoughts that you have, but sitting with them for a moment, waiting till they feel like they're bubbling up, and then being intentional about it is important. I think they also talked about their criteria. I think they really, a lot of the committee members really, that was their guide. That was sort of the signpost along the way, sort of pointing us in the direction that we needed to go. And I think that was something that they really found valuable, is going back to their criteria and helping focus the discussion. And the last thing I wanted to say was something that our priority group consultant, Vicky said, and it stuck with us. She started at our first meeting, which was midwinter 2015. She said, come to the process as a learner rather than a knower, which I thought was huge. That opens you up to something new and something that can change your mind. As Thom had said, changing your mind. So I think if you're a learner and you can learn from other people and your colleagues, rather than a knower, you sort of have these preconceived notions, I think that really opens you up to the process, and will allow you to let those books go, because that's a hard part of the process. And the last one is you will make great friends. That's just a fun part of it, but we were a tight knit bunch, so that's sort of the fun part of it all. So that's all I have. Oh, and you have a microphone over there.
Hi. I had the privilege of being the chair of the 2011 Caldecott Committee, and I also had 2 points to make, 2 basic categories of things. One has been touched on today, but I just really wanted to stress the value of testing the books with child readers and using them with kids, because we've all probably had the experience of kids reacting in very unexpected ways to books. We might look at a book before we use it and think, oh, kids are going to love it, and it just doesn't work at all. Or the opposite. I don't know if kids are going to like this at all, but let me try it. And you get a very, very enthusiastic response. So it's very valuable to test the books that your committee is considering with kids, as many different kids as possible in different settings. And some of the people on my committee had different opportunities to read books with kids, and that really, really informed the discussion. I was working in an office, and I didn't have regular contact with kids, so I had to seek out some cooperative school librarians who would let me run Mott Caldecott discussions in their school, but I was only seeing those kids for about 2 hours, so it was very limited, even though the teacher had prepped them. It was still valuable to me, but, and I did it at about 3 different schools, so it was very valuable, but other people on my committee had much richer opportunities that really, really helped all of us. One of my committee members was the fabulous and much beloved Robin Smith, who was a 2nd grade teacher, so she had the same group of kids for the whole year that she could test the books on, and that, of course, is a completely different kind of experience. Another one of my committee members was Megan Lambert, who runs story times at the Eric Carle Museum, where she uses the whole book approach, and she's written a book about it. If you're not familiar with it, you can look that up. But that's an interactive story time where the kids talk about every aspect of the book, the text, the illustrations, the design, all the decisions that went into the book. And some of the comments that she got were very astute, similar to the things that Katie was talking about this morning, that Margaret Jensen heard from her kids talking about the books. There was one school librarian on my committee, and so her experience with seeing the same kids throughout the year also helped inform the discussion. So that's something that I really feel is very important and enriches any committee book discussion, because there's something in every award criteria about the appeal of books to kids. Even though it's not an award for appeal, it's an aspect of the criteria in every award. The other thing I wanted to talk about is something that Thom has already mentioned. That's one of the downfalls of being at the end of the alphabet, and that's, but I'll put a slightly different spin on it. That's that there's no such thing as a perfect book. And that's really important, and I love your image and metaphor of the hot air balloon. I'm going to have to use that now, add that to my discussion. But sometimes people notice a flaw in a book and think this book can never win because this is a mistake or this is a flaw. And first of all, it might not actually be a mistake or a flaw, because as Katie said this morning, every book is a labor of love. People believe in that book, and that book has been through many, many hands that were trying to perfect it and try and eliminate any kind of flaws. It's been through an editor, an art director, a proofreader, a designer, and so many, many hands have changed and shaped that book. A lot of care has gone into creating that book. Something that you see as a flaw might actually have been intentional. And this happened with one of the books that my committee selected. I can't tell you any details because of confidentiality, but let me see how much I can tell you. There's something that we thought was a mistake, but we didn't think that it detracted enough from the book to make it not a choice we wanted to honor. And then in conversation with the illustrator later, I was able to ask that person, and why did you make the decision to do this? And I was hoping I was asking casually enough that the person wouldn't realize why I was asking. And this person explained very logically that that had been a conscious design decision, something that my committee thought might have been a mistake. So you never really know what the intent was behind the book. Also, things that you might see as a flaw might, as Thom was saying, not detract enough from the book to remove that book from consideration. People have pointed out, for example, things like anachronisms, or what they think are anachronisms in the illustrations, and they may or may not be. And even if they are, you have to weigh that against the entirety of the book. And I have a personal example of that, which I can give you because I was not on the committee. So The Wednesday Wars by Gary Schmidt is set in a Long Island suburb in 1967-68. And so in a 7th grade class. So this is about 6 years or so before I was growing up in a similar Long Island suburb. And there's a bar mitzvah scene that I just felt was totally wrong. And I went to a lot of bar mitzvahs in about that era, and I was sure that this would remove the book from consideration, that there was just something very, very wrong with that scene. And I have to assume that the committee noticed that, because committees read books very, very closely. Well, lo and behold, the Wednesday Wars was a 2008 Newbery honor. So the committee must have decided that what I saw as a mistake didn't really detract too much from that book overall. So you really have to balance what you see as things that detract from the book and the overall positive aspects of the book. And when you're preparing for the book discussion, I would say that you need to be prepared to talk very specifically about what you like and don't like about the book. That it can't be, oh, I just love this book. You have to give your specific reasons. And I saw everybody doing a great job with that this morning. So I think that's about all I had to say now.
I'm usually close enough to the end of the alphabet that I'm often naturally last. So what they all said. I think that one thing that I have to add that has not been said already is how important it is to remember that although you are reading these books and discussing these books and selecting these books, the books are not for you. And they're not for your kid, necessarily. They are for a hypothetical audience that is out there in the world, well, in the United States, because that's our purview. But it's very hard when you spend months and months and months reading and rereading and writing and taking notes and talking about it. It's really, really hard sometimes to keep that in mind. I regret to say that I am a knower, not a learner. So it's been a discipline that I have acquired over the years. And I work best with anecdotes, so I'll try to give you some anecdotes that illustrate some of the moments that I have experienced that have really changed the way I've looked at books, and they are all, they all play in some part into this whole notion that the book is not for me. And the first example I have is when I was on the Notable Children's Books Committee. And one of the books we were talking about was Suzanne Collins' Gregor the Overlander, which was the first book in the series that she wrote before the Hunger Games. Everybody should read it because it's really good. And I thought that it was a good adventure. It was fun, but it was so formulaic. It had a prophecy. It had a select questing band, and there was one of every kind except there were 2 cockroaches. So you knew that one of the cockroaches was going to die at the end because that was the prophecy had somebody's going to die. And I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but the book has been in the world for a long time. I knew every beat of the way through this book what was going to happen because I was at that point in my 30s, 40s. Well, anyway, older than the audience. And I had read a ton of quest fantasy. And I was all ready to shred the book by saying it was really predictable and blah-de-blah-de-blah. It was not venturesomely creative, which was one of the criteria for the Notable Children's Books Committee. And Beth Goldseth was introducing the book, and she said, "This is training wheels for quest fantasy. It has everything they need to know. It's got the questing band, it's got the prophecy, it's got the one of everything." It was everything that I thought was a liability in this book, but she made me realize that no, this was actually exactly what 4th and 5th grade budding fantasy readers needed to read to understand the conventions of fantasy. And so that was a moment when I felt like my head was sort of lifted up and then turned around 45 degrees and put back down again. And it's a disorienting feeling, but I really welcome it these days because it, I think, has made me a better learner. And I hope a better critic. So that was one really valuable moment for me that, as you can tell, has stuck with me. Another was a book that I loved a lot. It strummed every string on my heart harp. And it was Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy by Gary Schmidt, another Gary Schmidt book. And it was set in Maine, and it was great, and it told me about this aspect of Maine history that I did not know. And it had this fabulous figurative language, and he was able to maintain this sort of metaphor of the sea breeze as a character in the book that I loved a lot, and I could go on and on and on. And in a conversation with Deborah Taylor, she said, crushing me completely, call me an old lady, but I'd like to think we've got past the point where the black character has to be a plot device in some white kid's coming-of-age story. And once again, my head was lifted up and turned around 45 degrees and put back down again. And I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what's happening in this book. And I had to complicate my really kind of embarrassing love for this book with a different way of looking at it that not only informed my reading of that book, but has informed my reading of many, 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 because there are lots of books like that, ever since. So there's another one. And I think the third example I have is more of a general observation, and it goes back once again to the age thing. Before Marie Kondo was a thing, I realized that this is sort of my approach to books, which is I would grab the book and I would hold it tight, metaphorically or really, and think, I love this book, it sparks joy. And there was this period when I was on, once again, on the Notable Books Committee. I was on for 4 years, so I have a lot of stories from notable children's books if you want to hear them all. And I kept on reading all of these books that were for 14-year-olds, and they were really, really good. They had complexity of character development, lyrical language, very, sort of artful plot structures, and they were great. They rang, once again, every little harp string was going ding, ding, ding. And I kept nominating them, and Lisa Falk, who was on the committee with me, kept on saying, they are not children's books. They are not children's books. And I say, but they go up to 14. We go up to 14, and I can understand, there are definitely 14-year-olds who will love this book. And very slowly, I realized, and I think that actually I realized this not from, Lisa certainly planted the seed, but then I remembered in my library the same kid checking out a Babysitter's Club and an Eminem CD in the same transaction. And I realized this 12 or 13-year-old is operating as a child and as a teenager, and she's going to flip back and forth and back and forth and back and forth from one to the other. And this really helped me in the way that I read those books for the 13, 14-year-olds who are part of our oh my God, I forgot the word.
Spread.
Thank you. Anyway, they're what we cover. We cover 0 to 14, and all of these books that really, yes, they were for 14-year-olds or 13-year-olds. I realized they were 14 or 13-year-old teenagers, and it really helped me sort of readjust the way I was thinking of it, because we are the Association of Library Services for Children. These were notable children's books, and it helped me identify sort of conceptually those books that go all the way up to 14 but are operating as children's books, not as teen books. And that was another sort of lifting the head up and turning it around and putting it back down again that made a huge difference for me. So I hope that I'm a better learner now.
I have some questions for you guys, and then I bet these folks do too. I'm wondering, I think there are probably as many different ways to prepare for your year of award service as there are people in this room, and probably more. What's your strategy for preparing for that big midwinter discussion that's happening now somewhere?
Start. Well, I think, Thom mentioned people that have the reams of notes and people that don't. And I think finding what works for you is, I think I'm a copious note taker, so that's like my security blanket. And Judy mentioned, reading the books with kids. I think it's probably easier to do that with Caldecott than maybe some others. But I think that is super important. For Caldecott, I tracked down lots of different people that were artists, because I have artists in my family, so that was really easy. And that was really just talking to people that maybe are outside of the children's book world and getting their perspective on it was really kind of interesting, because they were looking at it with a different set of eyes than I was. And, I may not have always agreed with their thoughts, but that was really sort of, they were noticing things that I, didn't pick up on. And I think that was just, and then, and also I think listening to people's thoughts that are sharing with you, but also, taking that with a bit of a grain of salt. You're not going to agree with all the comments that are coming at you, and, and that's okay. That's part of what we're going to be doing at the deliberations anyway. So it's sort of like having some space within yourself for that. Like, okay, that's interesting perspective. I don't quite agree, but I'm glad I heard it. So.
This might seem kind of obvious, but reading the suggested background material that's in each manual can be really, really helpful. I was on the Geisel committee recently, and there were some great articles about children learning to read and what factors in books really help them. And that's something that I hadn't thought of because I've never been a reading teacher. So I found that enormously helpful. And a lot of the background material in the Caldecott manual talks about art and design. And I knew a little bit about that, but I certainly learned a lot more by reading those background materials. And those have been carefully selected by past committees. And so that's another really great way to prepare.
I have one, and that is to make sure you pace yourself so that you have time to reread. A lot of us have been talking about rereading. Rereading is a common theme, but if you aren't pacing yourself appropriately and you run out of time to reread, it's just very hard to get into a discussion. Realize, I don't remember. And then rereading opens up a lot more. The second time, once you've read for plot and you've sort of digested the book, as you can sort of dig in and be more critical, and you've got more of your brain available to notice stuff that you didn't notice the first time around.
Well, I'll build on that with a shout out to sort of strategic self-care, that you're going to get to the end of a year. I chaired the 2017 Newbery Committee, and I don't know how much we're allowed to share, but really we read hundreds and hundreds of books, and you get to the end of the year and you're rereading things, and people are nominating right up through December, and you've got a bunch of books you're going to discuss, and you haven't slept really since November, and you're tired, and you care deeply about this, and you're running on adrenaline. So if it's budgetings from January so you can hire a housekeeper in September, somebody to come mow your lawn, or scheduling the vacation you're going to take, or being super careful about the list of adult books or translated books or other books that you're going to read when you're allowed to, whatever it is, think about how physically taxing the job is and prepare for that.
I wish someone had given me that advice. So you guys have served and you have all chaired, and I'm wondering, the beautiful thing about committees is all the sort of the different people who come together with different experiences and different backgrounds and when you're chairing a committee and you have this group of people, some of them whom you may know and many of whom you may not, how do you approach turning this group of 6, 15, 8 people into a real team?
Do you just NECO Conversation Hearts?
Conversation Hearts?
What?
I missed that one.
NECO Conversation Hearts?
Say more.
Well, when you're chairing, and I chaired the 2010 Cybert, when you're on a Newbery, Caldecott, Geisel, or Cybert, and probably others not notables anyway, you get together to meet fairly informally. The 2019 committees are meeting this weekend. They don't have any books to discuss yet, but they are meeting so that they can get to know one another. And I brought Necco Conversation Hearts to my first meeting. I don't know that it was really the most successful thing, but nevertheless it did set a certain tone that I think helped, it helped the committee members to sort of know that there was a lighter side of me, because I can come off as pretty intense. And I think that was helpful. But it is just something that grows. I don't know that I've got any spectacular tips, and I don't know that the Necco Conversation Hearts would work with anybody else. But I chose them because it was winter and they were available, but also because they were easily transportable and they were from my region of the country. That's how the Conversation Hearts happened.
One thing that a lot of committees are doing now is something that was done for this symposium, which is start out with online introductions. So you know a little bit about the people before you actually meet in person, and it's already sparking some conversation. And jumping off from what Vicky said, provide lots of good snacks, or have people bring snacks.
It's important.
I was going to say snacks.
At our initial meeting at the first midwinter, we did an exercise and I asked everyone on the committee to bring a book that they loved that didn't win the Newbery. And I orchestrated it based on so what Rachel was saying earlier, to prepare people for the letting go piece, which is really, really hard. And I gave everybody 2 minutes to talk about their book and what they liked about it. And then I made them all put them in the middle of the table and say none of those books won, right? And you can still love them and they can still be wonderful, but this is what's going to happen, is a book that you dearly love isn't going to win. It's going to happen to all of us. But what I think a sort of unintended consequence was that we each got to learn about our compatriots as readers. It happened that each person sort of said, this is my reading identity. And so one of the very first introductions we had from one another was, this is who I am as a reader. It also was great practice for saying what you need to say in very short amount of time, which is practice that you need.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, snacks are important. I think you may not like everybody on the committee, but you need to respect them. They're at the table. They all have a voice. And, I think I like everybody from the 2016 committee, so that's easy. But, I've been with other groups and other committees and things where I didn't like everybody. But I wanted to listen and hear their perspective. And I think that's important. And I think just having that respect sort of generates that group bonding to some extent, even if you don't like them at the end of the day. And so.
And just keep eating. That's what I keep hearing. Don't let your blood sugar drop. Think back before you've served on any form of awards committee. What do you wish you knew? I didn't prep you for that, sorry.
Well, I don't know if this is an exact answer to the question, but one of the things that I have learned through service that I really, really appreciate is that before I served, I was really not suspicious, but I wondered a lot about the choices. And you'd hear the announcement Monday morning, and I would think, there'd be head scratchers or, really? Oh, really? And after having served, when you get to witness the process and see how much people bring to it, and the respect that Rachel's talking about, when you really observe how much goes into it, my response now is always, I didn't see that when I read that book. I better go back and look again, because 11 or 9 or 15 of the hardest working people in the business saw something that I must have missed, and it's my job to go back and look again. So I suppose to get it back to the question, I guess I wish I had a better understanding of what the awards are.
I mean, I think it's kind of like childbirth. You sort of don't know what it's going to be like, you know. Do you want the epidural? I don't know what the epidural would be in this context, but maybe the snacks, I don't know. You just sort of don't know what it's like until you're in it. And, you know, I think as much as we can try to share, and I think this kind of experience is awesome, and again, I'm jealous, but yeah, it just sort of, you have to be there, and you have to sort of be in the room, and I think I'm in a similar situation. I don't, you know, I may wonder why they picked a book, but I'm not going to say, oh, they screwed up, they missed the mark, they didn't know what they were talking about. You know, they were talking a whole bunch, so I know that this was a very conscious decision on their part. So you know, I don't question their decisions. I may wonder and want to look again, but I don't question that in the same way that I used to.
I would say that I maybe worried a little too much, and I felt a lot of responsibility. And the thing to remember is that it's a process, and it's a committee coming to consensus. And there's some magic in that of course you want to be well prepared, but you also want to relax and enjoy it. And so I think I was a little too nervous, my first award committee, that I wish I could have focused more on the joy and the fun of it.
I was told by a former committee colleague once when we'd been trapped in the airport for a while, and we just got to talk, and he said, "Wow, you're a lot more fun than I thought." I thought you were when we were serving together. So I guess I would echo what Judy said. I should have been a heck of a lot more relaxed. I really worried hard.
Oh, you guys. All right. I have one more question before I open it up to everyone else. So we have a room full of people here who are interested in maybe being where you are someday. They've spent a great day, or they're spending a great day. We're not done yet. What should they do next after they leave?
Show up. If they ask you to do something in ALSC, show up. Show that you're available and you're interested and you're committed. I think that's always been my advice to people that want to get involved. Even if it's for, you know, a small process-based committee, you know, that, you know, it's not something super glamorous. That work is really important too. So show up for that.
And this is pretty much what Rachel said, but fill out the committee volunteer form and put down other things that you're interested in besides the award committees, because there's camaraderie that builds on all the other committees too. There's a lot of virtual committees where you're building a different type of camaraderie. You're learning more about the organization, and there's a lot of value and interesting, enjoyable work that goes on in other types of committees too.
And take your opportunities locally also. You know, if you're not able to get to ALA twice a year, make sure that you are getting to what you can do at home, and make sure that you are speaking up when you have the opportunity to speak up. It's good practice. People hear you, and when when circumstances do allow you to come to ALA, it makes you all that much more prepared to act and to just throw yourself in instead of hanging out at the edges of the wall because you haven't had the opportunities and the experiences locally.
Yeah, I think any opportunity to practice is an opportunity you should take advantage of. We've talked already about the value of sharing books with kids and leading book discussions with kids. Personally, and we talked about this a little bit in the morning session as we were discussing, I find it less useful to understand the books themselves and more useful to understand the kids. And one of the criteria that I think exists in some sort of iteration in all of our manuals speaks to a respect for a child audience. And it can be really easy in the abstract to say, well, right, I don't think that 13 and 14-year-olds really have an astute enough emotional development to appreciate the romance in Aristotle and Dante discover the universe. But then you see an 8th grader devour A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, and you're like, well, maybe they do. So it doesn't have to be the book that we're reading with kids, but practicing is super critical. And as far I was, when it was my job to make the appointments and I was reviewing committee volunteer forms, the ones where there's a little part at the bottom where you're sort of like, what else do we need to know? That's what we need to know. The appointing person wants to know what you're doing with book discussions where you are. And if it's leading them or participating in them or facilitating them with young people, as the appointing person myself, I can't think of anything that I would have put at higher value than, well, I didn't have the Moore seminar to look to, but apart from this that you already have on your resume, what you're doing to practice.
Thank you, guys. All right. There's a wealth of knowledge here. You guys probably have questions about how all this goes. Let's hear them. Yes.
Okay, so I've never served on a committee, so these questions may be elementary for some of y'all.
Speak up really loud.
Oh, how do you manage the sheer amount of books I know you must get when you serve on a committee, like your life, your work, all that? Like, how do you deal with that?
Are you asking how you physically handle the books?
Like, how do you manage all these, there's a ton of books. How do you give them a fair reading while also going to work, having a life, that kind of thing?
Well, the reality is you do give up other things in your life during the year that you're serving. That's just a reality, and you do that for a short space of time for the greater reward of being on an awesome, prestigious committee and having a great time and selecting an important award. And you block out time for reading, and people have different techniques for prioritizing the books. Some people have one shelf that's their top 20 books that they're focusing on, and obviously anything that's suggested or nominated by your fellow committee members, you're going to be giving more attention to. Another thing that we didn't say to prepare is very, very obvious. You've got to prepare space. You need to find space at home or at work for a large number of books. And in a small New York City apartment, that can be very tricky. So yes, the sheer physical aspect of it, thank you for bringing that up, is not something to make light of.
And just for y'all personally, as Anna, what kind of things did you give up, or what kind of sacrifices did you have to make that work for you that year?
Television. So, yeah, I mean, I was also going to say, there's sort of a bit of triage reading. I mean, there's some books that you just, you're going to be spending more time with than others. And so, it's not like every book gets the same chunk of time, because there's some that are, going to be the balloons that are rising up. So I think you sort of have to sort of think in your mind, okay, there's something here, and I don't think I need to spend a lot of time with this one. And you'll sort of develop that sense. So I think, just sort of knowing that. And the chairs get everything. We get the self-published books. So we're not getting just the ones from the publishers, but we get a lot. So we're triaging all the time. So.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that a book doesn't have to be sent to you to be considered, and it's up to everybody on the committee to be looking beyond the books that are arriving and thinking about in our work on a day-to-day basis what other books that a publisher might not have thought would be in contention for the Newbery might we think we should evaluate. And where Rachel was talking about the triage thing, I think that's absolutely right. And that's another place where you trust your committee members and trust the process. Because I might give a 3-chapter reading to a book and set it aside and say, this isn't going to do it for me. Somebody else might read all the way through and suggest it, and then I've got to go back, or I get to go back, right, and read it again myself. But I don't know that there's really a way for you to read all the way through and give the attention to everything, which is why we do it together.
I think another thing that's important is to be self-aware as you're reading. Some books can be read under any circumstance, and some books really require, quiet or unbroken time. And if you find that a particular book just isn't grabbing you, rather than thinking that this isn't a keeper, try to be sort of self-aware of the circumstance. If you're trying to read it in a 20-minute lunch and people are talking, it may not be the book's fault. It may be the kind of book that needs a deeper opportunity to read. So as much as you can, mix up what you're reading so that you're not reading 20 sensitive Southern coming of age stories one after another, because it's going to be really hard for that 20th to stand out the way it may deserve to. But also be able to open up your reading situations so that they suit the different books. And I know that's a lot easier said than done. But
Did anyone else take a reading vacation? I remember taking vacation to read. Another strategy. Who else has a question? Way back in the back. Carmen.
Just to follow up to that question,
Yeah.
so is December like the month that is really a concentrated month? Or, yes, just to follow up to what Thom said, like after November.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. At least for Newberry, each committee member will nominate 7 books. I think it's 2 in October, 2 in November, and 3 in December. Or is it 3 the first? I can't remember if 3 is the first. Is it 3, 2, and 2? But at the end, and the nominations, we heard this morning, the nominations, each committee member brings 7 forward, and the sum total of everyone's nominations is the discussion list. Mathematically, it's possible that all 15 people on the committee would nominate the same 7, and you'd only have 7 to talk about. I don't think that happens very often. It's also possible that there's no overlap at all and you'd have 105, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, because some people are going to nominate, there's going to be some overlap. But you don't know what the final number is until December, and then there's a little place where things that arrive or things that we discover are published after the final nomination, but still inside of the year of consideration, can also be brought to the table, and then the rereading begins. For any of the books, no matter how long they are, you're going to be spending hours and hours with each one rereading. And if you've got 75 books and you've got to reread each one between, the beginning of December and the beginning of January, that's a lot of reading. Does that help?
Yeah, that
You in the black sweater. Yes.
Other than volunteering to serve on anything else asks you to do, is there anything else you would recommend? Like, should we be reviewing in journals? Should we be blogging about our experience with kids? Like, if that isn't a regular part of your existence, are you going to fall under the radar? And it seems like you've been lucky enough to serve on multiple committees, and if the committee is only 6 people, and there's already been people on there before, how can you make yourself look more desirable to those committee members if they're already full of people who've done an amazing job previously?
Tom's the only one who's made committee appointments out of all of us, right?
Well, and I served on the Newberry once, and then I served as the Newberry chair once. But I don't mean to suggest that that's not an incredible wealth of opportunity. But I have not served over and over again on a bunch of committees, and I think it's probably, I know not every. There have been Newberry chairs who have never served before, but I'm glad that I had the chance to serve before I chaired. But in terms of preparation, to me it's less about credentialing and more about being good at it. So if reviewing books would help for a journal would help you be good at it, then go and find a place to review books with journal, right? Review for a journal. If working with kids would help you be better at it, then do that. And there's no magic secret thing that you can do. These, the president has to make something on the order of 700 appointments in a year for all of the different committees, and I can't know 700 people. right? So you do your best. And a whole lot of it is about balance. The membership elects the first half of the committee, and the president appoints the second half. So when it comes time to make the appointments, I'm looking at who has already been elected and what they look like. So if I've got an overwhelming number of academics, I'm gonna look for practitioners. If I have mostly public librarians, I'm gonna look for school librarians. If I've got mostly people from large metropolitan areas, I'm gonna look for people who work with kids in a different way. So some of it is kind of out of your control. It's, so I hear that you want to do this. We all want to do this, right? It's why we're here today. But Rachel's advice to show up and do it, if you show up and do it, if you take what's offered to you and make a commitment to be the best committee member you can be, and make sure that you are really ready to do the book evaluation award committee work should the opportunity arise, to me that's the best way to get ready, because all the people that you interact with are going to notice. And
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, Thom's done the appointments, but, you know, there are the other positions that are elected. So I think showing up, showing that you're a hard worker, that you're committed to ALSC, you know, that sort of gets your name out there, you know, with the membership, and they're doing the voting. So they'll remember, like, oh, she was great on that committee that I was on, and he was great. And, you know, so I think that really helps, you know, of just sort of knowing that that person, you know, was committed and involved.
also, this is a little bit off topic, but only vote for as many people as you want to win, right? So you'll be able to, there will be 16 people running for 8 spots, and if you vote for 8 people and you're just kind of filling in the last 4, every person you're voting for who you don't know is now competing with the people who you do know. So if there are 3 people on the ballot who you really want to win, vote for those 3 people, because the 4th vote is going to be a vote against the 3rd person who you really want to win. If that makes sense, that's my strategy for you. Do with it what you will.
Wow. Ooh, okay, you in the stripes.
What's the actual, so if you get appointed, when you get appointed, when does your service start? What happens at the first meeting? Like, what happens at, you meet at annual, right? But then the decisions come at midwinter? How does that go?
Well, I guess I'm plugging a blog post that I wrote. I wrote a blog post for Colin Caldecott. It's called the Caldecott Calendar. If it would be helpful, it sort of outlines sort of what the year looks like. So, because I was sort of confused by that. I'm like, when is this? I'm on the 2016 committee, but we're looking at books in 2015. I mean, it's a little confusing because just the language that sometimes is used around committees. So, and there's a timeline in the manual too that's really helpful. But I mean, we can go through it, but I don't know. It might be confusing, you know. I don't know if anybody wants to chime in.
Well, you basically, for the ones with stickers, it starts in midwinter when you just have your getting to know each other and your NECO Conversation Hearts meeting. And then at annual, you have a meeting where you are discussing a fairly limited number of books because you simply haven't seen that many books. And then you are reading separately and making nominations through the fall. And then in usually January, this year February, you get together and you make your big decision. And then the following annual, the medal is presented and you celebrate.
The glasses.
I was on this mock Caldecott, and I didn't even know how to go about organizing my notes. There's so many different ways, and like how do you recall that? So like, what's your process for taking and organizing notes for these books?
You mean our personal sort of strategy, or?
Yeah, like
Okay.
what do you do personally to organize? Like, do you take notes while you're reading it the first time? Do you read it first way through? Do you like buy books and highlight them? Like, do you put it on your computer? How do you organize stuff?
I think it's probably different for every person. You don't want to start a whole new scheme when you're on an award committee. There may be ways that you organize your notes when you're doing a presentation or when you're writing a book review. So I think it's somewhat of a personal thing. I know for me, I sometimes forget characters' names a week after I've read the book. So I always made a list of main characters and then a one-sentence description of them. So I would remember characters' names.
Well, I do think that you want it to be some personal, a way that will work for you, but each manual actually includes in the back a sheet that sort of outlines the terms and criteria for that award and would function as a great place to begin note-taking. So absent something that already exists that you really like, it would be a really great way to just go through and, okay, character, all the little tick marks, sort of fields to fill in.
I love Post-its, so I would stick, I had lots of picture books because it's Caldecott, and I would stick Post-its and little flags on the pages of spreads that I liked, and that was helpful. And then I could take the Post-its out of the book and put them on a sheet to take with me because I wasn't going to take all the books with me. So that was, I think that made it more transportable. So.
Yes.
I know there's a lot of rules for the eligibility of books, and how do you make sure that a book's eligible before you read it all?
You check with your chair. Oh, the question is, how do you make sure a book is eligible before you commit 6 hours to reading it? Read the jacket flap bios. If somebody was born in Uruguay and still lives there, then unless you have reason to believe that person got U.S. citizenship somewhere, probably it's not going to be eligible. If you have a question, this person resides abroad, but I don't know if they're still a U.S. citizen, you ask your chair, and your chair does that work for you.
Yes.
So I realized that it changes throughout the year, but we kind of danced around how much time commitment is. Part-time job, three-quarters-time job, full-time, full with tons of unpaid overtime,
It's so variable. If you're a fast reader or a slow reader, if you've got multiple small children, I don't think that there is a single answer. It's a lot, and it's probably more than you can imagine. However, hundreds of us, thousands of us at this point have done it, and most of us would do it again if we had the opportunity. So if you like spending a lot of time with books, then chances are it's going to be good and you'll be able to figure it out. Is that too loosey-goosey for people who are more in charge than I am?
I think if you can find ways to also integrate it into your work or your personal life, that is awesome. I had a 5-year-old at the time, so when I was in 2015, so our reading time just became eligible books, and so my son is convinced there should be a Caldecott medal that has a picture of a cow on it, and when you press it, it moves. But that's sorry, a home story, And then also, I think if your professional life, that someone asks you to go do an outreach at that school, we'll take some eligible books with you, and can you share them with the group? So find ways to integrate it, and get in sneaky reading time here and there.
Well, and it's also true that it isn't an even workload throughout the year, that books start trickling in the spring, and you're sort of seduced into this understanding that it's going to be manageable, and then it turns into the kind of, you're the frog in the pot of water, and all of a sudden it's really boiling and you don't know when that happened. To me it feels like a 3/4, if you need a number, I'd say it's a 3/4 time job, but the preponderance of the time happens at the end of the year. It's not spread out evenly. You don't get to just add a little bit every week.
Oh my goodness. Please.
Yeah, so some of you have talked about how you can have a perspective shift, particularly with, after reading a book and hearing other committee members and sort of having that shift, maybe mid-committee. So how can you talk about how serving on a committee has helped sort of inform your work post-committee, how that maybe has changed, and how you approach what you do?
Well, having the real practice, I think, makes you better at having book discussions in other settings, such as running mock discussions at your job or just in general participating in book discussions. And as Thom and Rachel said earlier, it really makes you respect the process so that you'll never question an award committee's decision before, and you can then share that with friends and colleagues who are questioning the decision. How did they choose that? Well, they didn't choose it lightly. They read very, very closely. They read, reread, and reread the books that they honored and had an intense discussion. So it totally changes their perspective on how the process works. And having practice in consensus building and being able to give up books you love really helps in many, many ways of other aspects of your professional work.
And something the committee that I worked with when I reached out, they said that it was really just fascinating to look at like a whole year of publishing and sort of the trends and what sort of what comes out when, and it sort of gives you an interesting sort of bird's eye view of sort of a year of sometimes on a particular format like picture books, but sort of just, and it's really sort of fascinating just to see that, and it sort of gives you a little bit of an inside understanding of how publishing works, which I think is important for librarians to be aware of.
You can learn a lot. I mean, you don't have to just, this may sound fatuous, but you're reading a lot of nonfiction, no matter what committee, well, with the possible exception of Geisel, because there's not a whole ton of early reading nonfiction, but you learn a lot. And, you never know when you're going to find a need for a fact that you learned.
Well, I would agree with Judy that the skills are really easily transportable. So that's a great benefit, just like managing your time and attending to details, which are not my long suits. I got better at that. But I would also say that you meet people and know them and trust them in a way that you don't often get to do. And I still will pick up the phone and write, I've got a question for Megan Schlesman, who I served with in 2004. And right, so she's the person. I'm like, hey, can you help me with this? I mean, you really do. You come up with a group of people who will have your back in a way that not every other group of people might.
And it expands your reading horizons. I normally don't read a lot of fantasy, but when I was on Newberry, I was forced to read a certain amount of fantasy and was surprised by how much I liked a lot of it. So it can really expand what you thought were your reading tastes.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. I know you've had your hand up.
With regards to the Caldecott, we look at the whole book, the cover, the end papers, the art, blah, blah, blah. How much of like the book construction and binding do you also consider when evaluating the book? If the binding is cracking, or you can see a seam within the gutter that is out of the artist's control, does that? I've gotten varied answers on this question, so I'm now polling the panel.
Well, I don't know.
There is no answer. That's why you're getting varied answers, because it's something that the committee discusses. And like I was saying, there's no such thing as a perfect book. Every book has flaws. Books are made by human beings, so they will have flaws. And something that might be seen as a flaw has to be discussed in the overall context of the pros and cons of the book. That there is no one easy answer to that.
And I think it's important to remember that you're talking about the book itself and not the authorial or illustratorial intent. And so if a book is bound in such a way consistently, not just your copy, but every single one, smooshes a critical character's face in the middle in the gutter, even if that had something to do in production, nothing to do with the illustrator, it's still something that is in the book that you are considering right now. And that's, whether it is a fatal flaw or not is up to the committee.
And it's in the criteria. It's a visual experience for children. So what is that actual physical object? What kind of visual experience is the child having? And are any of those things marring that visual experience? So.
Or success is the presence of excellence and not the absence of mistakes. And I would love to think that a self-published book could go all the way one day, and a self-published book probably isn't going to have the same production values that a traditional book would have. And I would hate to think that we were discounting every self-published book that came in just because, it didn't. So again, there's not an answer, and I think it's a really good example of exactly the kind of work that the committee gets to wrestle with and work on together.
Last question. Back in the back, Aaliyah.
Well, committees often will ask an expert reader to read the book, and you may have been reading articles about sensitivity readers, which is a fairly new term, but committees can ask somebody with experience or expertise in that particular topic to read the book and offer their comments.
What about the committee itself? Can you speak about the diversity within the committee itself, or what your experience has been there?
I've been on 100% white committees. I don't think that I can speak to the sexuality of everybody on the committee. I've been on lots of all-women committees. I think that, and my last committee service was almost 10 years ago, and the world has become a lot more aware in the last, I guess it's 8 years ago, my last committee experience. But I think that everybody is trying to get smarter. And whether everybody is getting smarter at the same rate or in the same way is something else. I mean, I think that, I don't think that a committee can say, look, person of color over there, read this book and tell us whether it's okay. That's extra information. That person's response is extra information that's going to go into the conversation. But I think that what's more important is for committee members to be aware that they may have grown up reading in a very particular cultural tradition, and that cultural tradition may be one that needs to be questioned. And Aaliyah, I don't have a great answer for you. I know that cultural considerations have been put into the manual now where they were not when I was serving on committees. So having regard to ALSC's commitment to diversity reflected in the committee process as much as possible, I think, in terms of committee membership, but also in individual committee members' thinking is part of the process now where it wasn't before. And I think that the listening and the self-educating is something that committee members need to do on a near constant basis. And I think that a comfort with discomfort is important. But I guess I will go back to my own image of lifting my head up and turning it around. And I think that the more we all do this as a community, and the more each one of us does it individually, the better we will get. But that's the best I can come up with an answer, because I'm not chairing a committee. I can't say, here, you educate yourselves this way. But I know that the culture of ALSC is changing in a way that it is something that we are thinking about and being a lot more careful about than we were 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And we should have been then, but.
Right.
Well, and I would just add that everything that we're talking about today is predicated on the idea that we're all here to help each other. And if we are all doing the self-preparation and reading and self-education that Vicky's talking about, and if we're all sort of checking our biases and questioning the responses that we're having to books, the way Rachel's talking about, and if we're all working really, really hard to share the books with kids and acknowledge that there's no such thing as a perfect book, and and trusting one another, that I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to be open to putting this book forward and listening to the way other people respond to it. And I'm going to come to the table having done as much reading as I can about what other people are saying about the cultural content, whatever it may be, and listen to my compatriots, that's going to be enough, if we're all doing it right.
But I still feel like org committees need to be more diverse. I think I think a lot of people feel that way. I feel like I can see, and I can even see sort of, I served on the 2009 Caldecott and the 2016, and there was a big shift in our conversation, I think, about this. And I felt it in the room, just sort of the awareness. I think there's still a lot more work we all need to do. But it's interesting that I didn't really think about that, and that there was a big shift. So, but I feel like, and it's still frustrating that, that we're not even as diverse here and, in this room. So it's definitely something that is, I think it's getting better, but we have a long way to go.
And asking that question is a really important start.
And we are out of time, but I think that was a great question to end on. And we get to eat again, which is a theme of award service, as you're hearing. Can we give our panel a big hand for fielding your questions? All right, there's snacks outside. I want you, though, in your second discussion groups at 2:35, and you'll have 1 hour in there. Participants, you're in the same room. Facilitators, you're in a different room. If you're not sure what room that is, see me. But it's also on your.
Did you remember?
It's also on your.
I feel like I'm already
It's on your name.
I just take notes.
Who asked that?
Hi.
Detail.